The ballroom at the Meridian Grand was everything my husband had always wanted. Crystal chandeliers throwing diamonds of light across the ceiling, linen tablecloths so white they looked like fresh snow. 300 guests, dressed in their finest, holding flutes of champagne that cost more than most people's grocery bills. My husband had always believed that the size of a room told you everything about the man standing in the center of it. He was about to find out how right he was. I stood near the entrance for a moment before anyone noticed me. The way you sometimes pause at the edge of a swimming pool just to feel the temperature of the air above the water. The room smelled like gardenias and roasted lamb and something expensive I couldn't name. Somewhere near the back, a string quartet played something soft and forgettable. I watched the way people moved through the space, the way they laughed and touched each other's arms and leaned in close to say things they didn't want anyone else to hear. And there, near the bar, I saw my sister. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before. Red, off the shoulder, the kind of thing you wear when you want to be looked at. She was laughing at something the man beside her had said, her hand on his forearm, her head tilted at exactly the angle that meant she was performing. I had grown up watching that tilt. I knew what it meant. I had known what it meant for a long time. I smoothed the front of my navy dress, picked up a glass of water from the nearest passing tray, and walked into the room like I owned it. Because, as of 11 weeks ago, I did. My husband and I had met when we were both 26 and broke in different ways. I was broke from student loans and 3 years of working entry-level jobs in commercial real estate that paid almost nothing but taught me everything. He was broke from confidence, the kind of person who had enormous ideas and absolutely no infrastructure to support them. He was building a logistics software company in a rented office that smelled like old carpet and ambition, and he needed 2 things: a business loan he couldn't qualify for, and someone who understood contracts well enough to keep him out of trouble. I was both. I co-signed the first loan. I reviewed every contract for the first 3 years. I took a salary cut at my own job so I could consult for his company on weekends without it being a conflict of interest. I renegotiated his first major client deal when he came to me in a panic at midnight because he'd already shaken hands on something he didn't fully understand. I sat beside him at every difficult meeting for the first 5 years, not as a spokesperson, but as the person who could read a room and tell him afterward which relationships were solid and which ones were quietly falling apart. He was the face, I was the foundation. By the time the company turned 10 years old, it had 42 employees, contracts with 6 regional distribution networks, and a valuation that made people raise their eyebrows at dinner parties. My husband had become the kind of man who got invited to give talks at business conferences. His name was in the business section of local papers. He was photographed at charity events with the mayor. He had become, in every visible way, a success story. And I had become, somewhere along the way, invisible. It happened slowly enough that I almost didn't notice. The dinners he went to without me because they were work things, the trips that turned from 2 days to 5, the way he stopped asking my opinion on contracts, stopped calling me from the car on the way home, stopped reaching for my hand across the table the way he used to. I told myself it was growth. I told myself it was the pressure of running something big. I told myself a lot of things for a long time because the alternative required me to look directly at something I wasn't ready to see. It was my friend Claire who finally made me look. Claire was the kind of person who told you the truth the way a doctor does, not to be cruel, but because she understood that delaying the information only made the treatment harder. She had been my closest friend since college, and she had watched my marriage with the careful attention of someone who cared too much to pretend. She called me on a Thursday evening in January and asked if I could come over, not in a casual way, in the way that meant she had been rehearsing what she needed to say. I drove to her house and she poured me a glass of wine and she put her phone on the table between us and she let me look at what was on it. My sister's Instagram. Private account. But Claire had a secondary profile she used to monitor things she needed to monitor. A photo from 4 months ago. My sister at a restaurant I recognized. A restaurant my husband had told me was a client dinner I wasn't invited to. Her hand across the table towards someone whose face wasn't in the frame. The ring on her right hand. The same ring she'd worn since our mother gave it to her when she turned 30. And then another photo, more recent. My sister at a hotel rooftop bar, same city, a partial reflection in the window behind her, the reflection of a man with his back turned. A man in a dark jacket I had hung up in our closet exactly 6 days before that photo was taken. I sat with Claire for 2 hours and did not cry. That surprised me. I had always imagined that if I ever found out something like this, I would fall apart. Instead, I felt something cold and very clear settle into place behind my eyes, like a key turning in a lock. I asked Claire to delete the search history on her secondary account. I told her what I needed her to do going forward. I drove home, I made my husband dinner, I asked him about his day, and I listened carefully to every word he said. And then I started preparing. I want to be clear about something. What I did over the next 11 weeks was not revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is reactive. What I did was something closer to architecture, careful, structural, built on a foundation that could not be moved. I hired an attorney my husband had never heard of, a woman named Patricia who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for being completely without mercy. I pulled every document I had ever signed or co-signed and made copies. I had Patricia review the original loan agreements from the company's founding years, the ones that listed me as a co-applicant, the ones that my husband had quietly restructured 3 years in when the company was doing well enough that he no longer needed my credit rating on the paperwork. He had removed my name from the liability. He had not realized that in doing so, he had left a gap in the shareholder documentation that his own attorney had missed. Patricia found it. Patricia is very good at her job. There was a period of 6 months in the company's 3rd year when the restructuring had created an ambiguity in the equity split, a period during which my husband had promised me, verbally and in one email I had kept, that my contribution would be formalized once the documentation was updated. It never was. My husband had moved forward assuming the conversation was closed. Legally, it was not. It took 8 weeks of careful, quiet work. A purchase of existing shares from an early investor who had been unhappy with the company's direction for 2 years and was relieved to have a clean exit. The formalization of the historical equity claim. A transfer arranged through a holding company that no one connected to my husband would recognize. By the time the company's 10th anniversary gala arrived, I held 31% of my husband's company. Combined with the 6% that had never been properly removed from my name, I held 37%. The next largest individual shareholder, after my husband, held 11%. I had told no one except Patricia and Claire. I had smiled at my husband every morning. I had attended the gala planning meetings with the event coordinator and approved the floral arrangements and tasted the menu and done everything expected of the co-founder's wife. The invitation said co-founder's wife. I had noticed that. Patricia was seated at a table near the back of the room, dressed in a gray blazer that made her look like someone's accountant. She had a folder in the bag under her chair. We had agreed that she would not approach me unless I looked at her and touched my right earring. If I touched my left earring, she would leave quietly, and we would proceed as planned in the morning instead. It was supposed to be a backup plan. I circulated through the room for the first hour the way you do at events like this: small talk, light laughter, champagne I didn't drink. I spoke to the head of the distribution partnership and his wife. I spoke to 2 board members I had known since the company's early years, men who still remembered the nights I'd spent reviewing contracts on their behalf, who shook my hand warmly and told me the company wouldn't be what it was without me. The way people say true things without understanding what they're saying. I accepted their compliments. I filed them away. My sister found me near the appetizer station just before the program began. She was holding a glass of red wine, and her smile was the careful kind, the kind that was working hard to look natural. "You look beautiful," she said. "So do you," I said. We stood together for a moment in the noise of the room, and I felt her looking at the side of my face, the way she had been looking at me for months, checking for cracks, checking to see if I knew, checking to see if I was about to say something that would blow the whole thing open before she and my husband were ready. I had spent weeks perfecting my expression for exactly this purpose. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "For the speech?" "Why would I be nervous?" I said. She laughed once, quickly, and looked away. At 8 o'clock, my husband took the stage. He was good at this part. He had always been good at this part. He filled a room without effort, had a voice that carried warmth without trying, knew instinctively how long to pause before a punchline to let the audience lean in. He thanked the team. He told the origin story the way he always told it, the scrappy beginning, the early struggles, the slow climb. People laughed and nodded. A few employees near the front were visibly emotional. I watched from my table and thought about how much of that origin story was mine and how much of it had been quietly edited over the years. He talked for 15 minutes about the company's future. New markets, new partnerships, the next phase of growth. He was building to something. I could feel it in the room. That particular held breath quality that means an announcement is coming. Beside me at the table, my husband's colleague leaned toward his wife and whispered something. On the other side of the room, I saw my sister set down her wine glass. "The last 10 years have been extraordinary," my husband said, "but I've come to realize that moving into the next chapter requires honesty. And I've never been more certain of anything than I am of the decision I'm about to share with you tonight." He paused. 300 people waited. My wife and I will be separating. The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in waves, the way a crowd processes something unexpected, the people nearest the stage first, then rippling outward as the information traveled from face to face. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the woman at the table to my left. I heard someone's fork set down against their plate. I heard my own heartbeat, very steady, in my ears. "I know this isn't what anyone expected tonight," my husband said, and to his credit, he looked uncomfortable, not ashamed. Uncomfortable? The way you look when something necessary is also somewhat inconvenient. But I've also come to believe that the best way to honor what this company stands for is to be fully transparent about where I am personally and where I'm headed. And I want to introduce someone who has become an important part of both my personal life and the company's future. He turned toward the side of the stage. He lifted his hand in the direction of my sister's table, and my sister stood up. She smoothed the front of her red dress. She smiled the way she had been practicing. She looked out at 300 people who knew her as my sister, who had seen us together at this company's earlier milestones, who knew our family. She looked at me for exactly 1 second with an expression I had been waiting weeks to receive, the expression that said, "It's done now. There's nothing you can do. It's already over." I reached up and touched my right earring. "Before we continue," I said. My voice was level. Not loud, but the room was so quiet by that point that it carried easily. My husband looked at me with the expression of a man who has planned something carefully and has just noticed an unexpected variable. My sister's smile changed shape slightly. I stood up from my table. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, and I was not sorry at all, and everyone in the room could hear that I was not sorry at all. But before the evening moves forward, I think it's important that the board members and the major stakeholders in this room have accurate information about the company's current ownership structure. Patricia was already walking toward the stage from the back of the room. "Patricia has documentation for anyone who'd like to review it," I said. "But the summary is this. I currently hold 37% of this company. That makes me the second largest individual shareholder in this room. It also means that any significant structural changes to leadership, including the introduction of a new executive partner, require my approval under the shareholder agreement." My husband's face had changed in a way I had never seen it change before. It was not anger, not yet. It was the specific face of a person who has realized that the ground beneath them is made of something different than they thought. "I've spent 10 years making this company possible," I said. I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at the board members, the ones who had shaken my hand earlier that evening, the ones who knew I reviewed contracts when there was no money to pay lawyers. I co-signed the first loan when there was no other option. I sat in every difficult room and said nothing when the people in those rooms needed to believe this was one man's achievement, because I understood that the story they were buying was his, and I was willing to let it be. I paused. I was willing to let it be for a long time. I looked at my sister then. She was still standing. Her face was the face of someone who has rehearsed for a very different scene. "You're welcome to have each other," I said. "I genuinely mean that. What you won't have is this company. What you won't have is the house, which is in my name, which I purchased through my own income before we were married and which was never part of the joint asset agreement, something our attorneys can confirm. What you won't have is the vacation property, which was transferred into a family trust 3 months ago. What you won't have is the investment account, which was opened in my name before the marriage and which my husband was permitted to access as a courtesy. The room was so quiet I could hear the string quartet, who had stopped playing but had not yet understood that they should probably pack up and leave. What you will have, I said, and I looked at my husband one more time, is exactly what you've built on your own, without me, which, according to the original financial records, is a company with a great deal of potential and a significant amount of debt. I'm sure you'll manage. I picked up my clutch from the table. Congratulations on 10 years, I said to the room. It really has been remarkable. I walked out of the Meridian Grand through the main entrance, and the doorman held the door for me, and I stepped out into an April night that was warm and smelled like rain on pavement, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Claire was waiting in the car at the curb. She had known to be there by 8:30. I got in. How did it go? She asked. Exactly the way Patricia said it would, I said. She handed me a cup of coffee she'd gotten from the place down the block, the one that had been our coffee shop since we were 22, the one that still made it exactly the way I liked it. I held the cup in both hands and watched the lights of the hotel entrance through the windshield. Are you okay? Claire asked. I thought about that for a moment, honestly. I don't know yet, I said. But I'm not okay. She nodded. She understood the difference. She pulled away from the curb, and we drove through the city, and I watched it pass and tried to name what I was feeling, which was harder than I expected. There was relief, which I had anticipated. There was something that felt like grief, which I had also anticipated, the grief of losing something you had already lost before you lost it, the grief of all the years you had spent being willing to be invisible. There was something else, too, something without a clean name, something that sat between pride and exhaustion and the specific kind of peace that comes from having done a very hard thing very carefully. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved the way Patricia had promised it would, not quickly, but with the inevitability of something properly constructed. My husband contested 3 things and lost 2 of them. The third was settled in a mediation I attended with the same steady calm I had walked into the ballroom with, and when it was over, I drove home to my house, my actual house, the one that had been in my name since before I met him, and I sat in my kitchen and ate dinner by myself, and it tasted better than any meal I had eaten in years. My sister called me once, about 6 weeks after the gala. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was long and complicated in the way that messages are when someone is trying to be multiple things at once, apologetic and defensive and self-justifying, all in the same breath. She said she hoped I understood that she hadn't wanted things to happen the way they happened. She said she hoped we could eventually find a way to be family again. I saved the message in case I needed it later. I did not call her back. What I did instead was something I hadn't done in years. I called a commercial real estate contact I'd kept in touch with loosely, a woman who had always told me I had a better instinct for deals than most people she'd worked with. I told her I had some capital, I was prepared to move, and I was interested in looking at something specific, a mid-sized, mixed-use development in a neighborhood I had been watching quietly for 3 years, the kind of project that required someone with both the patience to understand why it had stalled and the clarity to see exactly how it could be unlocked. She told me the project was in a complicated state. I told her I was familiar with complicated states. She laughed. We had coffee 2 days later. I want to tell you that the best part of the story is the look on my husband's face when I stood up in that ballroom, and there is some truth to that, because I am human, and there was satisfaction in it that I am not going to pretend wasn't real. But the best part of the story is actually the coffee I had 3 months later with the real estate contact, the one where she pushed a file folder across the table to me and said she thought this was the one where I opened it and saw in the first page of the executive summary exactly the detail I had suspected was the key, and said, "Yes, I think you're right." The one where I ordered a second cup of coffee and we stayed for another 2 hours because there was actual work to do. The best part of the story is the work. I had spent 10 years doing work that was absorbed into someone else's narrative. I had spent 10 years being a foundation that no one named, a structural element that held up a building that everyone only ever looked at from the outside. I had done it willingly, for a long time, out of love, and then out of habit, and then out of a failure of imagination about what else I might be. What else I might be was something I was beginning to figure out. Patricia told me once, near the end of the legal process, that the thing that distinguished my case from most of the ones she handled was that I had come in already knowing what I wanted. Not in the way that most people think they know what they want, the emotional version, the I want him to suffer. I want her to be embarrassed. I want everyone to see the truth, but in the practical sense, I had known what documents I needed. I had known what numbers mattered. I had known what the long game looked like. Most people are so focused on the moment, she said, the confrontation, the reveal. You were the first client I've had in a while who seemed genuinely more interested in what came after. I thought about that for a long time afterward. What comes after is the part no one talks about. The story that gets attention is always the moment, the ballroom, the announcement, the earring, the walk to the door. And I understand why. Those moments are real. They carry the weight of everything that came before them, and they have a shape that makes sense, a clean arc, a beginning and a middle and an end. You can describe them. You can hold them up to the light, but what comes after is longer. What comes after is getting up every morning in a house that is entirely yours and learning how to make it feel that way. It's calling your mother and having a conversation you've been putting off because you didn't want to answer her questions about how things were going. It's running into your husband's former colleague at the grocery store and watching the uncomfortable calculation on his face whether to acknowledge what he witnessed, whether to apologize, whether to simply look at the yogurt and pretend the entire thing never happened. He chose the yogurt. I wished him well internally and moved on. What comes after is also the day, about 4 months after the gala, when the real estate project came through the way I had believed it would, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my attorney's office after signing the final papers and called Claire and said simply, "It worked." "The deal?" she said. "The deal," I said. "And everything else." There was a pause, and then she laughed. The real laugh. The one I had known for 20 years. And I laughed too, and we stayed on the phone for a while not saying much because there wasn't much that needed to be said. My sister and I have not spoken since her voicemail. I don't know if we will. I have thought about this more carefully than you might expect. Not from anger, but from a genuine attempt to understand what the relationship actually was and what it might become, and whether the second thing is possible given the first. I don't have a final answer yet. I'm not in a hurry to get one. My husband and his company are doing what companies do when they lose their structural support, managing, adapting, finding new ways to hold things together. He has not reached out to me. I did not expect him to. The gardenias at the Meridian Grand Ballroom were beautiful. I remember thinking that clearly as I walked in that night, that whoever had designed the space understood how to make something look like it had always been exactly as it was, perfectly arranged, effortlessly perfect, with no evidence of the labor that had gone into it. I had spent 10 years being that kind of labor for someone else's arrangement. I have been thinking about flowers lately, about what it means to arrange something of your own, about what it means to stand in a room that you have built and to look at the light falling across it and to know, in a way that requires no documentation and no attorney and no earring signal, that it is yours. I'm still figuring that part out, but I am figuring it out in my own house, at my own table, with my own coffee, and the window beside me looks out on a street I chose, in a neighborhood I understood before anyone else understood it, and outside the light is the particular gold of an early morning in spring, and the day has not started yet, and everything that happens in it will be mine. That's enough, for now. That's more than enough.